The wind howled like a beast across the empty land of ice and snow as Jace stepped out of his small transport ship and looked around slowly with narrowed eyes and a heavy breath that turned to mist in the air as cold as deep space. His boots crunched softly as he walked forward, slowly one step at a time, across the thick snow that had no end in sight and no color except white upon white, with faint shadows dancing across the surface as the sun stayed hidden behind the heavy gray sky. He had been sent to Glaciera 7 for a simple mission, one he did not choose, but was given as part of his duty to deliver supplies to an abandoned research outpost that had stopped sending signals weeks ago, with no sign of life since. Most people avoided this planet for one reason alone: it was deadly cold, colder than any place on Earth, and far from any trade route or settlement. And if a system broke down here, survival would not last more than an hour. Jace had no choice, though. He was already here, and the job had to be done, so he walked through the snow with his scanner blinking softly in his hand, showing no movement, no heat signatures, and no life at all. He liked the silence, but not this silence. It felt wrong somehow, too quiet, too empty, like the land was watching him or hiding something from him. And he could feel the hairs on the back of his neck rise, even with his thermal suit on. Then suddenly the scanner blinked twice fast and turned red, and for a second he froze, thinking it was a glitch, but then the signal came again, faint but real, and not far, maybe 200 meters away ahead. He raised his eyes and looked into the distance, where a sharp gust of wind cleared the snow just for a moment, and in that moment he saw them. Two shapes lying close together near a low ridge, not moving, barely even visible under the thin cover of white. They were not human. Jace rushed forward with his heart pounding, not sure what he was running toward, and not sure why he felt such urgency in his chest, as if something deep inside him told him they needed help now, not later. He reached the ridge and dropped to his knees beside the two figures, both female, both alien, and both almost frozen solid, but still breathing with soft, shallow gasps that fogged the air slightly near their blue lips. Their skin was a soft, pale silver with faint, glowing patterns like stars moving under the surface, and their eyes were closed tight, as if dreaming or lost in some deep place far away from here. They wore thin suits that were torn and covered in frost, not meant for this cold, and one of them had her arm wrapped around the other, as if trying to keep her warm, even in her sleep. Jace didn't think, he just acted. He opened his emergency pack, pulled out two thermal blankets, wrapped them tight around the bodies, and lifted them one at a time onto his sled, dragging them gently, but quickly back toward the outpost shelter where the heater was still working. Inside the small outpost, the air was warm but stale, and the lights flickered slightly as power ran low, but it was enough to save a life, maybe two if he moved fast. He placed the two women on the heated floor near the center, where the warmth was strongest, and set up the medical scanner, which beeped softly as it ran checks and injected microheaters into their veins. Time passed slowly as he watched, and weighted eyes locked on their faces, hoping to see any sign of life, any movement, any change that meant they would be okay. The taller one moved first, her fingers twitching slightly, then her lips parting in a soft breath as her eyes opened slowly and looked at him with glowing blue irises that held both fear and wonder at the same time. She tried to speak, but only managed to whisper in a strange language, one he had never heard, but somehow understood a little, not the words, but the feeling behind them. She was afraid. Jace smiled gently and held out his hand with no threat, just calm, slow kindness, hoping she would see he meant no harm and that she was safe now. She blinked slowly, then looked at the other girl beside her, still sleeping, with her head resting against her arm and a soft blue glow pulsing in her chest, like a heartbeat slowing down to normal. He saw the concern in her eyes and nodded once to let her know the other one was okay, still breathing, still alive. The alien girl reached out and touched his hand lightly with fingers that were warm, now no longer ice, and her touch was soft like silk and full of thanks that needed no words. Jace sat back slowly and took a deep breath as the tension left his body for a moment, and he felt the weight of what just happened settle into his bones. He had come here for a simple job, but found something else, something strange and beautiful and lost in the snow, and now that he had brought them back, they were no longer strangers, they were people. He looked at them again, one awake and watching him, the other still resting, and he knew this was just the beginning. He did not know their names or their past or what brought them to this frozen place to die alone with no one to hold them or save them. But now they were here and alive and looking at him like he was more than just a man in a suit, like he was something important, something rare. Jace leaned against the wall and let the silence return, but this time it felt different, not empty, not cold, but full of something quiet and strong. Outside, the wind still screamed across the frozen world, and snow fell in endless waves, but inside that small shelter 3 lives had crossed, and nothing would ever be the same again. The heater hummed gently inside the small shelter, while Jace moved quietly from corner to corner, checking systems, adjusting dials, and doing his best to keep everything running as the snowstorm outside slammed harder against the thick walls of metal and ice. The 2 alien girls still lay near the heat unit, wrapped in thick thermal blankets and slowly recovering from what could have been a cold, silent death out there in the endless white. Jace had been trained for hostile environments and emergency survival, but never for something like this, never for finding 2 unknown alien beings almost frozen to death on a planet that no one was supposed to visit anymore. He kept glancing at them, unsure of what to do, unsure of what they needed, unsure of who they really were. The one who had opened her eyes earlier was now sitting up slightly against the wall, her silver skin glowing faintly in the low yellow light, and her long dark hair falling over her shoulders like soft black ribbons. She watched Jace with calm, curious eyes, her gaze never angry, never afraid, only silent and focused, as if trying to read his soul without asking a single question. Jace walked over slowly and knelt beside her, careful not to move too fast, and placed a heated pack in her hands. She took it gently and held it close, then pointed to her chest and spoke in a soft voice. "Alira." He nodded slowly, understanding that she was giving him her name, and after a pause he pointed at himself and said his own name. "Jace." Her lips curved into a small, gentle smile, and for a moment they just sat there, 2 strangers from 2 worlds, surrounded by wind, snow, and silence, but somehow connected by something real. The other girl still slept, breathing deeply under the warm layers, her face peaceful, her body no longer shivering, and Jace could see that she was starting to heal, just like her sister. Alira turned her head toward the sleeper and spoke one word that sounded like love and memory wrapped in soft sound. "Novi." Jace understood it without asking. She was her sister, her family, her reason to fight the cold and stay alive. He stood up and walked to the supply cabinet, pulling out more heated food packs and a container of purified water, which he set near Alira, along with a simple spoon and cup. She looked at the items with confusion at first, then slowly reached out and took one pack in her hands, watching how he opened his before, doing the same with care and quiet curiosity. They ate in silence, broken only by the crackling of wind outside and the soft sound of water being poured into metal cups, as Jace made sure she had enough to drink. Alira's eyes sparkled as the warmth spread through her, and her shoulders relaxed slightly, no longer tense with fear or pain. She said something in her language again, pointing toward the window, and then to herself, and then to Jace, and though he could not understand the exact meaning, he felt that she was trying to explain something. He pulled out his old translation device, a worn little tool from his academy days, and activated it, holding it toward her with an inviting gesture. She hesitated for a moment, then spoke a few soft sentences into the device, which buzzed and blinked and slowly translated her words into basic human speech. "Crash ship, broken, lost, long time, no help, cold, scare, hungry." Jace stared at the small screen, then looked back at her, his heart heavy with the truth that these girls have been stranded out here for days, maybe weeks, with no one to hear their cries and no way to call for help. He typed a reply and let the device speak for him. "I found you by chance, not mission, not plan. Just luck. I'm glad I found you." Alira's expression softened, and she reached out her hand, gently placing it on his arm in a quiet gesture of thanks that needed no more words. The heater clicked louder as it worked harder against the cold, and Jace checked the power levels again. Not great, but enough to last a few more days if he conserved energy. He returned to the center of the room and sat across from Alira, keeping his eyes on the sleeping form of Novi, who was started to stir, now her fingers twitching under the blanket and her lips parting slightly as she woke. Alira leaned forward quickly and took her sister's hand, whispering soft sounds full of comfort and relief, and Jace stayed, still letting the moment pass between them. Novi opened her eyes, slowly blinking in confusion until her gaze settled on Alira, then on Jace, then on the soft light around her and the warmth in her body. She whispered something Jace did not understand, and Alira answered her with a smile and a squeeze of the hand. Jace waited quietly until Alira looked at him again and spoke into the device. "She is Novi, my younger sister. She is safe now, thanks to you." Jace nodded and smiled, gently feeling the strange weight of this moment. Two alien girls alive and safe in his shelter, trusting him without knowing him and holding on to each other like the storm was still out there waiting to take them back. He felt something shift inside him, something quiet and deep, not duty, not command, but care, real human care for two strangers who were now more than that. Alira looked at Novi, who was sitting up slowly with help, and offered her a food pack, which she accepted with a tired smile and a soft thank you spoken in rough human words that made Jace blink in surprise. They were learning already fast, smart, and strong, even after what they had suffered. The shelter lights flickered and Jace stood to check the systems again, tapping the screen and muttering softly as he adjusted settings and reduced unnecessary power drains. He would make this place last as long as needed for them, to recover for them, to stay safe until he could call for help or figure out what to do next. Alira watched him move and whispered something to Novi, who giggled softly, her voice like wind chimes under a winter sky, and Jace turned back to see them both looking at him with eyes full of warmth and light. They were not just survivors, they were something rare, something new in his life, and he could feel the connection growing slowly, like fire warming frozen hearts. Night came quickly on Glaciera 7, and the storm grew louder outside, but inside the small shelter, three souls sat together, sharing warm food and the beginning of something none of them had expected. Something that would change all of their lives forever. The morning on Glaciera 7 looked no different from the night, as the sky stayed dark and heavy with snow, and the wind never stopped howling across the frozen land like an endless whisper from another world. Inside the small outpost shelter, the air was warmer and full of soft light coming from the ceiling panels that flickered now and then trying to hold against the storm outside. Jace stood near the control panel watching the data on the screen as he adjusted the power flow and checked the oxygen levels, knowing every second counted on a planet like this where nature had no mercy and no care for survival. Behind him, Alira and Novi sat close together, wrapped in fresh blankets, their silver skin glowing faintly in the soft yellow light, and their eyes full of questions they had not yet asked. Jace turned and looked at them slowly, wondering how two beings so delicate and quiet had made it through the storm and the cold and the silence without breaking. They had survived somehow, even with their ship gone and their bodies freezing, and now they sat in shelter watching him move, as if trying to learn everything about him with their eyes alone. Alira tilted her head and spoke into the translation device, her voice calm and low, and the machine translated after a pause. "We thought no one would come. We thought we would become ice like the ground." Jace nodded gently and typed a short message into the device, letting it speak for him in return. "I almost did not see you. You were far from the route I was walking." Novi leaned forward slightly, her eyes soft and her voice shaking as she spoke one word in broken English. "Lucky." Jace smiled without speaking and walked to the small table where he placed new food packs and water near the girls, then stepped back, giving them space as they reached forward and began to eat with slow, careful movements. He watched the way they moved, so light, so smooth, as if gravity barely touched them, and he realized their bodies were not just different, they were made for another world, maybe one with lower gravity and softer light than Earth or Glaciera. Alira looked at him again and pointed to the wall where a picture hung showing Earth from space, glowing blue and round and full of clouds. "Home," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. Jace followed her gaze and nodded again. "Yes, that is my home." She blinked slowly and looked down at her hands and back up. "Ours is gone." The words hit harder than he expected, and Jace stepped closer, trying to understand. The translation device hummed as Alira spoke again. War, disease, famine, we ran from it all. Our ship was one of the last. We had no plan, only escape. Jace stood in silence, listening to the sadness in her voice and feeling the weight of her words pressing against the small room like another storm waiting outside. You are safe now, he typed, and let the device say the words for him. Novi looked up and smiled, faintly a tired smile, but one that reached her eyes, and Illyria nodded slowly, her hand resting on her sister's arm with quiet care. They were close, more than just siblings, maybe all they had left in the universe, and now they were here on a planet full of cold with only each other, and now with him. Jace pulled over a small chair and sat across from them, leaning forward and speaking gently. Do you remember your crash? Do you remember what happened? Alira nodded. We lost control, entered the wrong orbit systems, failed no guidance, we fell hard. Novi added softly. Fire everywhere, screaming silence after. She closed her eyes and leaned against her sister as if the memory was still fresh and painful and heavy. Jace wanted to ask more, but stopped himself. The answers could wait. They were alive now, and that was what mattered most. He watched as they ate slowly, their strength returning bit by bit, and their eyes brighter than the night before. After a while, Illyria stood with slow, careful steps, walking to the window and looking out at the white storm beyond the glass, her hands resting gently on the metal frame. She spoke without turning. Do you live here alone? Jace walked up beside her and shook his head. No, this is not my home. I came here for a mission to check the outpost and bring supplies, that is all. She looked at him now, her gaze soft and curious. And after? Jace paused, thinking about the answer. After I leave and return to the station above. She nodded slowly and said nothing more, but her eyes stayed on him for a moment, longer than needed, as if she was weighing something in her mind. Back near the heater, Novi had stood too and was walking around the shelter, touching the walls, the chairs, the control panel, like a child discovering a new place for the first time. Her fingers moved gently across the surface of things, as if every object had meaning and every light held a story. Jace watched her silently and smiled, then turned to Alira, who was still standing near the window, her expression unreadable. You are welcome to stay here as long as needed, he said through the device. She nodded once and said nothing more. The rest of the day passed slowly, with quiet moments and soft words shared between the three of them, and Jace found himself surprised by how easy it felt to talk to them, to sit near them, to simply exist together in this strange, quiet world. They were not like humans, not in body, not in voice, not even in thought, and yet there was something familiar about them, something honest and real that made the silence feel less cold and the hours feel less long. That night, as the storm outside screamed louder than before and the lights inside dimmed, to save power, the three of them sat around the heater, wrapped in warmth and light and memory. Alira told stories of her old world, of rivers made of light and forests that sang in the wind, and Jace listened with wide eyes and quiet wonder. Novi laughed softly at her sister's words and added little details in her broken English that made the stories come alive in strange and beautiful ways. Jace shared stories, two tales of earth, of oceans and cities and skies full of stars, and he watched their faces light up with wonder and longing. The shelter was small, but for the first time since arriving it felt full, not with things, but with life and warmth and something more. Something that grew stronger with every glance, every word, every shared breath. As the night grew colder and the power hummed softly through the walls, Jace looked at the two alien girls and felt something shift deep in his chest. This was not just a rescue, not just survival. This was the beginning of something new, something he did not fully understand yet, but he could feel it already, and so could they. The storm outside continued for another day, and then another, the sky never clearing the snow, never slowing the wind, never resting, as if the planet itself wanted to keep everything cold and buried in white silence forever. Inside the shelter, the heat remained steady and the lights flickered less as Jace adjusted systems and made small repairs using old parts from the damaged equipment scattered in crates along the back wall, where dust had not yet settled. Alira and Novi moved more freely now, their strength returning more each hour, their steps lighter, their voices clearer, and their eyes always following Jace as he moved from place to place, checking wire scanning systems, boiling water, and making sure every breath they took was safe and warm. The space inside was not large, just one main room with a heater in the center, a control panel on one side, and two small sleeping pods pushed against the wall with makeshift beds made of thermal blankets and foam packs taken from emergency kits. They had nowhere else to go and nothing else to do, so they shared everything: space-time, silence, and the slow build of trust between three lives caught in a world too cold for second chances. One morning, Jace woke to soft laughter, not loud, not forced, just light and warm and real, and he turned to see Alira and Novi sitting together near the heater, whispering to each other in their language, pointing at something in his pack that they must have found while he slept. It was an old photo, a small faded print of Jace, standing beside a riverbank on Earth, his hand raised in a wave, and his face younger and full of a calm he had not felt in years. Alira looked up and smiled, holding the photo gently like it was something sacred, something rare and precious, and Jace felt his heart beat a little louder in his chest without knowing why. He walked over and sat beside them, letting the photo stay in her hand, and reaching for the warm food pack they had already opened for him, their way of saying thank you without needing to speak. Novi watched him eat, her head tilted slightly, her silver eyes curious and calm, and her voice soft when she finally asked in slow, careful English, "Do all humans live near rivers?" Jay smiled and shook his head, then pointed at the picture and said, "Only lucky ones." Alira leaned closer and whispered a word in her language that the translator picked up as peace, and Jace nodded slowly, because somehow she understood more than most people he had known. The days passed gently with moments of silence, broken by soft conversation and shared meals and laughter that grew a little louder with each passing hour, as if the storm outside could not reach the warmth growing inside. Jace found that he liked hearing their voices, liked the sound of their laughter, liked the way they listened to his stories, and asked simple questions that made him think about things he had forgotten long ago. He told them about Earth, about his childhood, about oceans and trees and the smell of summer rain, and they listened with wide eyes and quiet smiles like each word was a small gift from a world they might never see. In return, Alira spoke of their lost world, of cities that floated above glowing fields, and of songs that shaped crystals into tools, and homes and bridges that moved with the wind. Novi added details, her voice soft, her hands drawing shapes in the air, and Jace imagined those places so clearly he could almost see them outside the window where only snow and wind now lived. One night the power dropped, suddenly the lights flickering hard and the heater sputtering as the backup kicked in with a slow hum that made Jace's chest tighten with worry. He rushed to the panel and checked the system, his fingers flying across buttons and keys, while Alira and Novi stood behind him, watching quietly, not afraid, just focused as if ready to help if he asked. The system had overloaded, a coolant leak near the fuel line, nothing dangerous yet, but serious if left alone. Jace pulled on his gear and grabbed his toolkit, motioning to the girls to stay inside where it was warm and safe, but Alira stepped forward and said firmly, "We help too." He tried to say no, but her eyes did not leave his, and behind her Novi was already putting on a jacket one size too big, taken from the storage locker near the door. They stepped out together into the storm, walking slowly through the deep snow toward the fuel unit behind the shelter, where ice had formed a thick shell around the metal structure. Jace worked fast, his fingers numb inside the gloves, his breath thick in the air, and his visor fogging slightly as he used the torch to melt the ice and patch the line. Alira handed him tools without asking, each one the right one. Novi cleared snow from the vents using a shovel with steady arms and silent focus. Together they fixed the system, then hurried back inside, where the heater returned to full strength and the lights glowed steady once more. Jay sat down hard near the wall, breathing heavy and shaking snow from his coat, and when he looked up, Alira was kneeling beside him, her hands reaching to remove his gloves, slowly, gently, carefully. She placed his hands near the heater and sat close, without a word, her warmth pressing against him like a blanket made not of cloth but trust, and something deeper that he could feel but not name. Novi brought him hot water and sat on his other side, resting her head lightly on his shoulder, like it was something she had always done, like it was something that felt natural and needed. The silence held no awkwardness, no fear, only peace and calm, and a strange quiet joy that made the cold outside feel like another planet entirely. That night, they slept close together in the same corner of the room, the heater humming, the storm outside, roaring like a forgotten memory, and Jace felt something he had not felt in years. He felt wanted. Not for orders, not for missions, not for tasks or skills or titles. Wanted simply for being there, for caring, for choosing to stay. And in their presence, under soft lights and thick blankets, he knew with quiet certainty that his life had changed not by plan, not by force, but by a choice made in a moment he never saw coming. They had needed him in the snow, and now he needed them in the silence. 3 hearts beating in the same small space, warmed by more than heat. Warmed by something that had no name yet, but would only grow stronger with time. The days on Glaciera 7 had blurred together in a soft rhythm of cold outside and warmth inside the shelter, where Jace, Lyra, and Novi shared everything from food and silence to laughter and quiet dreams as the snowstorm slowed at last, and the wind began to lose its voice. The world beyond the walls still looked endless and white, but inside the 3 souls had found peace in their strange new bond, one that felt stronger than anything Jace had expected when he first landed on this frozen planet. He had almost forgotten what it felt like to be alone, and now the thought of leaving this place without them felt heavier than the snow that once buried their broken ship. Jace spent his mornings checking the systems and walking outside to gather scans while the sisters cleaned the space and organized the few supplies they had left, always working together, always smiling when he returned with frost on his visor and snow in his boots. They had built something inside those walls, not made of tools or metal, but of shared breath, shared warmth, shared hope, something human and something alien all at once. But peace never lasts forever, not in a place like this. It happened one quiet evening when the wind had calmed and the sky above the shelter was still a deep gray, when Jace heard the sound he never wanted to hear again. A long, sharp beep from the radar system, a signal pulsing red on the screen near the door, a signal that did not belong to weather or nature. A signal that meant someone or something was entering the atmosphere. Jace leaned over the panel and stared at the numbers as they flickered across the screen, his fingers tapping fast, his breath held in his throat, while the data confirmed what he feared most. A ship was approaching, not a supply ship, not human, not scheduled, and not expected. He turned toward Lyra and Novi, who stood frozen near the heater, eyes wide, their faces pale, their glowing skin dimmer than usual, and their lips parted not in shock, but in recognition. They had felt it too. Novi stepped forward and said one word with a trembling voice that made Jace's heart sink. "Hunters." Lyra looked at her sister, then at Jace, her voice calm, but firm when she spoke into the translator, her words slow and full of heavy meaning. "They have found us." Jace grabbed his pack and checked his weapon, a small but powerful energy rifle that he had kept sealed since arrival, hoping he would never need to use it here, not in this place of peace. He handed extra thermal coats to the sisters and told them to stay low, but Lyra shook her head, and Novi stepped closer, both refusing to hide, both ready to stand by him, no matter what came next. "We fight together," Lyra said, her voice no longer soft, no longer afraid. Jace hesitated, but something in her eyes gave him strength, something ancient and pure and full of fire. They moved quickly, setting traps near the entrance, placing thermal charges along the outer wall, and preparing light flares to blind any intruder who came close in the snow. Jace explained the plan while the sisters listened and nodded, their minds sharp, and focused their fear hidden beneath layers of resolve that came from surviving too much for too long. Night fell faster than usual, and the sky outside turned black as the approaching ship cut through the clouds, its shadow falling over the shelter like a claw reaching down from the stars. Jace took his position behind a snowbank just outside the main entrance, while Lyra and Novi stayed low behind cover near the emergency beacon, ready to disable it if the enemy tried to use it as a signal booster. Then the ship landed. It came down with a low rumble that shook the ground and kicked up clouds of snow and ice, its dark metal sides covered in strange symbols and rusted plates, its engines steaming in the cold air like the breath of a beast. The ramp opened slowly, and figures stepped out tall, wrapped in armor, their faces hidden behind glass masks, their hands holding weapons that buzzed with energy and death. Jace stayed still, watching every move, counting every step, waiting for the right moment. The lead hunter moved closer, scanning the ground, then stopped near one of the traps and lifted a hand to signal the others. That was the moment. Jace fired the first shot, hitting the snow just in front of the figure, triggering the thermal charge, which exploded in a wave of heat and light, knocking two of them to the ground and blinding the others. Alira activated the flare, which lit the area in blinding white novae through a stun grenade from her side, and the blast knocked one more enemy back into the snow. Jace ran forward, firing, carefully aiming for armor joints, moving fast between cover and keeping his breathing calm, while the sisters moved behind him, one covering his flank, the other disabling the beacon, so it could not send a distress call. The battle was short, but loud, the sound of blasts and shouts echoing through the ice and snow until the last figure fell with a cry that vanished into the wind. Jace stood panting in the snow, his rifle smoking slightly, his eyes scanning for movement, while his heart pounded like thunder in his chest. Behind him, Alira walked slowly past the fallen enemy, her face unreadable, her hand gripping a small energy blade taken from one of the fallen hunters. "They are gone," she said, her voice quiet but sure. Novi stood beside her, her hands trembling, but her eyes fierce as she looked toward the ship, still steaming and silent behind them. "We must destroy it," Jace said. "Through the device, they will come back if it flies again." Together, they placed charges inside the ship, near the core, near the weapons, and near the controls, then walked back slowly as the sky began to glow from the fire that rose from the wreckage, sending smoke and light into the frozen clouds above. Back inside the shelter, they sat in silence, wrapped in blankets, their bodies sore, their minds spinning, but their hearts strangely calm. "You saved us again," Alira said, her voice gentle. "No," Jace replied, "we saved each other." The storm outside had returned, wind, swirling snow against the window, but inside the fire still burned. Inside the three of them, something had changed, not just trust, not just closeness. It was something deeper, something felt in silence, something that would not fade, even as the cold tried to creep back in. They had faced death together not once, but twice, and now the bond between them was more than survival. It was something new, something unspoken, something real. And in the quiet of that night, as they sat together side by side, their hands touching softly in the warm light of the shelter, the cold could not reach them. Not anymore. The smoke from the burning ship rose high into the frozen sky, turning the pale clouds above into dark, swirling shadows that danced across the white landscape, while the cold wind howled like a voice mourning something long forgotten. Inside the shelter, the air was warm, but heavy with silence, as Jace sat with his back against the wall, staring at the screen that once showed peace and now showed nothing but static and cracked signals. Beside him, Alira wrapped a fresh cloth around his arm where a sharp blast had burned through his suit, and though the wound was small, her hands moved with care and purpose, her eyes focused and filled with worry. Novi stood near the window, watching the remains of the ship burn. With slow fire, her hands clenched into small fists, her body still trembling from the fight that had ended only hours ago, though it felt like another lifetime. The three of them had won, but the price of victory was not only bruises and smoke, it was also the weight of knowing that the danger was not gone, not yet, not forever. They had been found once, and they could be found again, and the question now was not if, but when. "We must be ready," Jace said quietly, his voice low and steady like the wind that slipped through the cracks in the wall and brushed against the fire inside them. Alira nodded slowly, and Novi turned to face him, her expression hard, but her voice soft when she spoke. "We stay together." The shelter no longer felt like a simple place of safety. It had become something else, a stronghold, a home, a space shaped by survival and trust, and something deeper that none of them dared to name. Jace rose to his feet and moved to the main console, checking the outer sensors, the energy levels, the oxygen levels, and the weapon's inventory, such as it was, and though he found nothing new, the silence of the screen gave him no comfort. The enemy had come once and failed, but they would not make the same mistake twice. He turned back to the sisters and said the words he had been thinking since the moment he saw the ship land. "We must prepare for a second attack." They worked all that day and into the night building barriers from old supply, crates, sharpening metal rods, to act as traps, loading small plasma cells into homemade launchers and marking escape routes across the nearby hills, using signal flares buried under the snow. Alira moved with quiet strength, her hands never still, her thoughts always ahead. And when Jace looked at her, he saw not only someone who had survived, but someone who had learned to lead even through pain. Novi worked quickly and without fear, climbing onto the roof to adjust the signal dish, repurposing parts from the burned ship that she had salvaged herself, and whispering songs from her old world as she worked, songs that made the shelter feel less empty and more alive. Jace checked every corner and every weak point, running wires and sensors, and setting up a last line of defense around the heater that kept them warm in the middle of a world made of ice. Together, they built something strong, not perfect, not professional, but strong enough to make a stand and strong enough to protect what they had created together. By the time the second ship arrived, they were ready. It came in low and fast, no warnings, no signals, no delays, only sharp engines cutting through the sky and landing with a crash that shook the ice and sent clouds of snow into the air. Jace stood near the main entrance, holding his rifle steady, while Alira crouched beside the central panel, ready to trigger the traps, and Novi waited by the sidewall near the emergency charge line, her fingers tight around the handle of a long blade pulled from the fallen enemy before. The ramp opened, and the figures stepped out, 5 of them, this time taller, faster, armed with heavier gear, and moving in tight formation like shadows with armor. They said nothing, just moved forward, silent as death and cold as the wind. The first step triggered a flare that burst into bright white light, and the second triggered a thermal blast that knocked one to the side, and the third sent a bolt of ice shards into the leg of another, forcing him down into the snow. Jace fired from his position, hitting the lead figure in the shoulder and sending sparks into the air, while Alira launched a blinding pulse that slowed the others as Novi leapt from cover and slashed at the third one with swift, burning strength. The battle was sharp and close, each second filled with sound and light and breath and pain, but they did not fall, they held their ground. Jace moved like a ghost between walls, firing steady and fast, his focus sharp, his heart full of something stronger than fear. Alira fought like fire, her movements fast, her eyes locked, and her steps never missing as she fired blasts from the salvage tech and blocked incoming shots with metal shields. Novi moved like wind, fast and sharp, dancing between them, cutting wires, knocking weapons from hands, and saved her sister twice before the third wave hit. They worked as one, a trio bound by more than need and more than survival. They were a force that had grown from snow and fire and blood and trust. When the last figure fell, silence returned, heavy and deep and wide. The snow fell again, soft and slow, like feathers from the sky, and Jace stood breathing hard, looking at the field around the shelter, now marked with smoke and fallen steel. "We did it," he said, his voice rough and low. Alira walked to him and touched his face, her fingers soft against his skin, her eyes full of something he could feel but not explain. Together, she whispered. Novi came close, her arms wrapping around both of them, her head resting on Jace's chest, her voice no more than breath. "We protect what matters." The shelter was damaged, but not broken, the walls cracked, but still holding the fire, still burning in the center of the room, where warmth had never truly left. That night, they did not speak much, they did not need to. Jace sat with one sister on each side, his hands holding theirs, his eyes watching the sky, where stars had started to shine through the thinning clouds. He did not know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew this moment was real. In the heart of ice and silence, they had made a stand, and in that stand they had found something worth protecting. And he would protect it for as long as breath stayed in his body and strength stayed in his hands. They were no longer just 3 lost souls, they were something more. They were home. The morning after the second battle came slow and quiet, with soft winds brushing the snow into long white trails that curled along the hills like the breath of a sleeping planet waiting for the next story to begin. Inside the shelter, Jace sat near the heater with his eyes half closed, listening to the sound of soft footsteps behind him as Alira and Novi moved about the small space, checking supplies, making warm drinks, and placing fresh thermal cloths on the floor, where the cold still crept in from the walls. They had survived again, and now the silence felt different, no longer heavy with fear, but gentle and calm like the quiet after a long storm when the sky forgets how to rage and the earth remembers how to breathe. Jace stood slowly, stretching his arms as the pain in his shoulder faded with the warmth of the heater, and he looked at the sisters who stood side by side, their faces calm, their hands steady, and their silver eyes glowing softly in the low morning light. The snow outside was no longer their enemy. It was just the world. They lived in a world they had tamed with fire and grit and the kind of bond that no cold could ever melt. They had been strangers only days before, caught in a moment between life and death with nothing but a chance encounter, and now they stood together as something stronger, something unspoken and real. Alira walked over and handed Jace a warm drink, her fingers brushing his with a softness that spoke more than any words, and when their eyes met there was no fear left, only something deeper and warmer, like the first sun after endless night. Novi came and sat beside him, resting her head on his shoulder, her hand holding his as if it was the most natural thing in the world, and maybe it was now, maybe this was the world they had made together. They shared their drink in silence, the only sound the crackling of the heater and the soft hum of systems slowly stabilizing after the damage from the attack, and Jace let himself feel the moment without rushing it, without questioning it. He looked at the two of them and thought about the stars, and how strange it was that of all places, of all times, they had found each other here on a frozen world at the edge of nothing. Later that day, they worked together, fixing the outer panels, sealing the cracks, and collecting parts from the broken ships to build something stronger, not just a shelter, but a true home. Jace watched as Alira fused metal plates with calm precision, her eyes focused and her movements smooth like she had done this 100 times before, even though he knew she had not. Novi sang softly as she sorted through wires and tools, her voice lifting gently into the cold air like a memory carried by wind, and Jace felt his chest tighten with something warm and bright. When the repairs were done, they stood together outside the shelter looking at the sky, which had started to clear, showing glimpses of pale blue between the fading clouds and the soft shimmer of distant stars. Alira pointed upward and whispered something in her language, and though the translator gave no words, Jace understood her meaning. Hope. He turned to her, and then to Novi, who stood with her arms folded and her head tilted as she smiled at him with that familiar look of quiet joy and silent strength. You saved us, Jace said, but Alira shook her head and placed her hand on his chest. We saved each other, she replied. Novi stepped closer and placed her hand over his as well, and in that moment the three of them stood like one, joined not by words or history, but by experience and choice, and something that no battle could break. They walked back inside together, the air colder now, but no longer biting, and the shelter no longer felt like a prison or a hiding place, but a beginning. That night, they sat near the heater wrapped in thick blankets, their shoulders touching, and their voices low as they shared stories and dreams and quiet laughter under the soft hum of power that now seemed to sing instead of groan. Jace told them about Earth again, this time about oceans that glowed at night and trees that moved with the wind and cities where lights danced across the sky like fireflies. Alira listened with wide eyes, her fingers tracing small circles on his arm as she asked simple questions that made him smile and remember how beautiful home could be. Novi rested her head in his lap, her breath slow, her eyes closed as she listened to her smile, small and peaceful, as if the sound of his voice was enough to carry her into sleep. He looked at them and knew something he had not known before, not with certainty, not with peace. He belonged here, not just to this place, but to them, to this moment, to the bond they had built from frost and fire and the will to survive together. He had come to Glacier 7 as a man, with a job, with a mission, with no plan beyond delivery, in return. But now he had found something more than survival, more than purpose. He had found love. Not the kind written in stories or played in songs, but the kind built slowly through shared pain and quiet moments and the touch of a hand when the night was too long. Days passed, and the snow softened and the wind slowed, and the sky above grew more clear with each sunrise. Together, they planted small seeds near the walls, tested water systems, built stronger panels, and carved markings into the outside walls, symbols of life, of memory, of unity. When a signal finally came from the distant station offering rescue, in return Jace stared at the blinking light for a long time, his heart still and his hands unmoving. Alira walked to his side and placed her hand on the console, then looked at him with eyes that held both the question and the answer. Novi leaned against him, her voice soft and sure when she said only one word. "Stay." And he smiled, because he already knew. He pressed a button and turned off the signal. And with that choice, he gave up a world he had known for the chance to build a new one. One shaped not by orders or stars or duty, but by love, by family, by the simple truth that sometimes the coldest places can hold the warmest hearts. And as they stood together in the shelter that had once been a cage, but now was a home, the storm beyond the hills faded into silence, and the sky opened at last, revealing the first light of a new dawn.